"So that's Margaret," Brittany said with a laugh loud enough for the entire patio to hear. "Our free childcare with a casserole dish." The words floated across the backyard on the warm June air and landed in Margaret Whitmore's chest with more force than if Brittany had slapped her. For a moment, Margaret simply stood there beside the folding table of paper plates and lemonade pitchers, her hands still wrapped around the tray of deviled eggs she had spent the morning preparing. Her son Daniel was standing right next to his wife. He heard every word. He laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, just enough. Just enough to let Margaret know he agreed. The women gathered around Brittany chuckled politely, sipping white wine beneath the striped patio umbrella as if nothing unusual had happened. As if reducing a 68-year-old grandmother to unpaid labor was charming party conversation. Margaret set the tray down carefully on the table. Her smile never faltered. "Excuse me," she said softly, though no one had actually spoken to her. Then she turned and walked toward the porch steps with all the calm dignity she had spent a lifetime learning how to wear. No one followed her. No one called her back. Inside the house, the air conditioning hummed softly against her skin as she stood alone in Daniel's kitchen, staring down at the mountain of dishes already stacked in the sink. She had arrived 3 hours early that morning to help set up for her grandson's 8th birthday party. She had blown up balloons until her fingers cramped. She had frosted cupcakes because Brittany said bakery prices were ridiculous these days. She had wrapped presents Brittany forgot to buy. She had done it all with the same quiet devotion she had carried into motherhood 40 years earlier. Because that was what Margaret Whitmore had always done. She helped. She gave. She made herself useful. But standing there in that spotless kitchen, listening to laughter drift in from the backyard, she felt something shift deep inside her. Not a burst of anger. Not tears. Something colder than that. Clarity. It had not started this way. First, Brittany had asked so sweetly, just one afternoon a week, "Margaret, we trust you more than anyone." Then one afternoon became every weekday after preschool. Then summer care. Then school pickups. Then overnights when Daniel and Brittany wanted weekends away. Then emergency babysitting whenever the nanny canceled, which seemed to happen suspiciously often. Margaret had missed book club meetings, dental appointments, lunches with old friends. She had canceled a weekend trip to Vermont because Brittany had forgotten to mention she and Daniel were flying to Napa. And every time Margaret adjusted her life without complaint, they thanked her less, until eventually they stopped thanking her at all. Somewhere along the way, love had turned into expectation. Generosity had turned into obligation. She was no longer Daniel's mother or the children's grandmother. She was infrastructure. She was unpaid staff. She was the reason their entire household functioned, and not one of them seemed to understand what their lives would look like without her. Margaret dried her hands on a dish towel she had not realized she was gripping and looked out the kitchen window at the family she had spent her life building. Brittany was laughing, one manicured hand on Daniel's arm, the other holding a wine glass Margaret had washed before guests arrived. Her grandchildren were running through the sprinklers, shrieking with joy. And Daniel, her boy, the one she had once rocked through fevers and taught to ride a bicycle in the church parking lot, had not defended her. He had stood there and laughed. Margaret's expression remained calm. Her back remained straight. But in that quiet kitchen, with frosting still under her fingernails and humiliation burning beneath her ribs, Margaret Whitmore made a decision that would unravel her son's household within a matter of weeks. If they wanted to know what life looked like without free childcare, she would be more than happy to show them. The next morning, Margaret woke at 5:30 the way she always did, her body still trained by years of routine even after retirement. For nearly 6 years, her mornings had belonged not to herself, but to Daniel and Brittany's household. By 6:15 she was usually in her sedan with a travel mug of coffee, driving the 20 minutes to their neighborhood before rush hour thickened the roads. By 7, she would be in their kitchen packing lunches, tying shoelaces, wiping syrup from countertops, and coaxing 2 sleepy children through the chaos of another school day. while Brittany rushed upstairs to finish her makeup and Daniel checked emails at the breakfast bar. That had become the rhythm of Margaret's life so gradually she had barely noticed it happening. What began as a favor after Brittany returned to work had transformed into an unpaid full-time position, hidden beneath the language of family helping family. Margaret remembered the first conversation clearly. Brittany had sat at her dining table with tears in her eyes, explaining that daycare cost more than their mortgage, and that she did not trust strangers with the children. Daniel had squeezed Margaret's hand and said, "You are the only person we trust, Mom." At the time, the words had felt like love, like honor, like proof she was still needed. So Margaret had rearranged everything without hesitation. She retired earlier than planned. She postponed travel. She turned down volunteer work at the library. She told her friends she was lucky to spend so much time with her grandchildren. And for a while, she believed that herself. But over the years the gratitude faded. The requests became assumptions, then demands. Brittany stopped asking if Margaret was available and began texting instructions instead. Pick up Emma at 3. Carter needs soccer drop-off at 5. We are running late. Feed them dinner. Bath if needed. Margaret had become less grandmother and more household employee, except employees were at least paid and thanked. There had been warning signs she ignored because she wanted peace more than pride. The time Brittany rolled her eyes because Margaret was 10 minutes late after a doctor's appointment ran over. The Christmas when Brittany handed her a framed photo of the children with the words "World's Best Babysitter" printed across the bottom, while everyone laughed as though it were adorable. The spring afternoon Daniel had casually asked her to cancel a long-planned weekend with her college roommates, because he and Brittany wanted to attend a couple's retreat in Aspen. "Come on, Mom," he had said. "It is not like you have much going on." She had canceled the trip. She always canceled the trip. That morning, for the first time in years, Margaret did not get dressed by 6. She stayed in her robe and sat at her kitchen table with a hot cup of coffee, listening to the quiet of her own home. 7:12. Her phone buzzed. Brittany. She let it ring. A minute later, another call. Then a text. "Are you on your way? The children are not dressed yet." Margaret stared at the screen for several seconds before setting the phone face down on the table. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Another message arrived. "Hello?" Margaret finally typed back with steady fingers. "I will no longer be available for childcare. You will need to make other arrangements moving forward." She pressed send, then took a slow sip of coffee while the phone exploded with incoming calls. Through the kitchen window, sunlight spilled across her garden. Birds moved through the hedges. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower started up. The world remained calm and ordinary, even as her son's carefully balanced household began to collapse without the woman they had mistaken for something permanent. Daniel arrived at Margaret's house that evening without calling first, his SUV pulling into her driveway so fast the tires crunched against the gravel with unnecessary force. Margaret saw him through the front window before he even reached the porch, his shoulders tight with irritation, his jaw already clenched. She opened the door before he could knock. "What is this about?" he demanded, brushing past her into the foyer as though he still lived there. "Brittany had to miss work. I had to leave an investor meeting halfway through because you decided to pull some kind of stunt." Margaret closed the door gently behind him. "It is not a stunt, Daniel." "Then what is it?" he snapped. "Because you cannot just decide to stop helping without warning. We depend on you." The word hung in the air between them. Depend. Not appreciate. Not love. Depend. Margaret folded her hands in front of her and studied her son carefully. He looked tired. She noticed. Frazzled. His expensive tie was crooked. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes. One difficult day, and already the cracks were showing. "That is precisely the problem," she said calmly. Daniel stared at her. genuinely bewildered. What is that supposed to mean? Margaret walked past him into the living room and sat in her armchair, smoothing her skirt as if discussing the weather instead of dismantling his assumptions. It means somewhere along the way, helping became expected. My time became yours to schedule. My life became secondary to your convenience. Daniel scoffed. Oh, come on. This is because of some joke Brittany made yesterday? You are seriously overreacting. Margaret held his gaze. It was not a joke. Everybody was laughing. Yes, she said quietly. That was the problem. He exhaled hard through his nose, already impatient with emotions he did not wish to examine. Mom, Brittany did not mean anything by it. You know how she is. Margaret almost smiled at that. She knew exactly how Brittany was. The issue was that Daniel knew too and had chosen comfort over courage every single time. And how is she? Daniel? She asked softly. Disrespectful? Entitled? Comfortable humiliating your mother in public because she assumes there will never be consequences? His face hardened. Do not talk about my wife that way. Interesting. Margaret replied. You found your voice quickly enough for that. Silence crashed into the room. Daniel's expression shifted. Only slightly. But Margaret saw it. The flicker of guilt. The recognition that she was not wrong. He looked away first. We are under a lot of pressure right now. He muttered. Things have been hectic. The kids. Work. Schedules. We need your help. Margaret leaned back in her chair. No. Daniel. You want my help. You need the free labor I have been providing for 6 years while telling yourselves it was family duty. His face flushed. That is not fair. No. She said. What was not fair was expecting me to organize my entire life around your household, while being spoken about like hired staff. He rubbed a hand over his face, his anger beginning to fray into desperation. So what? That is it. You are just done? You are punishing the children because your feelings got hurt? Margaret's voice remained even. Do not insult me by pretending this is about hurt feelings. This is about respect. And if the only way you value my presence is when I am useful to you, then perhaps some distance will help clarify matters. Daniel stood there for a long moment, searching her face for softness, for the mother who always gave in, always prioritized peace over pride. He did not find her. Finally he said, colder now. You are making a huge mistake. Margaret met his stare without blinking. No. Daniel. The mistake was yours. You forgot I was helping because I loved you. You started acting as though I owed it to you. He left without another word, the front door closing harder than necessary behind him. Margaret sat alone in the silence that followed, listening to the echo of it move through the house. Then she reached for her untouched cup of tea, now gone cold, and drank it anyway. It tasted bitter, but not nearly as bitter as being needed only when convenient. The following week taught Daniel and Brittany exactly how expensive Margaret's silence had been. By Tuesday, Brittany had exhausted every emergency contact in her phone. Her sister claimed she was too busy. 2 neighborhood teenagers were available only after school. The first professional nanny they interviewed quoted a rate that made Brittany's smile freeze in place. The second wanted guaranteed hours, paid holidays, and mileage reimbursement. By Wednesday afternoon, Daniel was taking conference calls from his car in elementary school pickup lines while Brittany tried to manage client emails with Carter climbing across her lap and Emma crying because someone had forgotten her ballet shoes. Their carefully polished life, the one they had balanced so effortlessly for years, was beginning to show the strain beneath its surface. Margaret heard about all of it through the family grapevine before anyone said a word to her directly. Her sister Helen called first. Did you really stop helping with the children? She asked. sounding half shocked and half impressed. Margaret, seated comfortably on her back porch with a mystery novel and a glass of iced tea, answered simply, "Yes." Helen gave a low whistle. "Well, Brittany has been telling everyone she has no idea what got into you." Margaret smiled faintly. "I imagine that is easier for her than self-reflection." For the first time in years, Margaret's days belonged to her again. She joined the morning walking group at the par by the second week. The cracks in Daniel and Brittany's marriage had become visible even from a distance. Margaret did not need to ask. The evidence arrived on its own in the form of frantic calls, whispered family gossip, and the exhausted expression Daniel wore when he dropped the children off for a Sunday visit. He suddenly seemed desperate to preserve. His shirts were wrinkled now. His hair, once carefully styled, looked as though he had been running his hands through it all day. Brittany, meanwhile, had stopped posting polished family photos online. Her social media, once filled with smiling brunches and coordinated outfits, had gone silent. It was Helen who delivered the clearest update over lunch one afternoon. "They are paying nearly $3,000 a month for childcare now," she said, stirring lemon into her iced tea with poorly disguised satisfaction. "And apparently Brittany is furious because the nanny refuses to do laundry, meal prep, or organize the pantry." Margaret gave a quiet hum of acknowledgement. $3,000 a month. More than Daniel and Brittany had likely ever paused to imagine Margaret's labor was worth. More than they had ever offered. More than they had ever thanked her for. That same evening, Daniel called. His tone was different this time. Less angry. More careful. "Mom," he began, with the strained politeness of a man attempting diplomacy after failed aggression, "I think maybe we all got off on the wrong foot here." Margaret, seated in her reading chair with a blanket over her lap despite the summer heat from habit more than necessity, turned a page in her book before replying. "Did we? Brittany feels terrible about what happened." Margaret said nothing. "She wants to apologize." Another page turned. "In person." Margaret lowered the book slowly. "Does she want to apologize because she understands what she did was cruel? Or because daycare invoices have changed her perspective?" Silence stretched so long she could hear him breathing. Then came the answer she had expected. "Does it matter?" Margaret smiled to herself. "Yes, Daniel, it matters very much." He sighed, frustration creeping back into his voice. "Mom, do not do this. We are trying here." "No," Margaret said evenly. "You are negotiating. There is a difference." He tried another tactic. "The children keep asking why you do not come over anymore. That is unfortunate. You could help fix this." Margaret's eyes sharpened. There it was again. Responsibility placed at her feet. As if their discomfort remained hers to solve. "Daniel," she said quietly, "for 6 years I gave your family more than time. I gave you freedom, careers, date nights, vacations, sleep, stability. I carried burdens you should have been thanking me for helping bear. Instead, you mocked me for it." His voice dropped. "We did not mock you. Your wife introduced me to guests as free childcare. She was joking. And you laughed." The silence that followed felt heavier this time. Less defensive. More ashamed. When he spoke again, his voice had softened. "I should not have laughed." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. It was the first honest thing he had said in weeks. But honesty, she knew, was not the same as accountability. "No," she replied. "You should not have." Daniel exhaled shakily. "What do you want from us?" Margaret answered without hesitation. "Respect. Boundaries. And for once in your life, I want you to understand that love offered freely is still valuable. It is not an entitlement. It is not an endless resource. And once people learn you do not value what they give, They eventually stopped giving it. Daniel said nothing. Margaret returned her gaze to the window, where evening light stretched long shadows across her yard. If Brittany wishes to apologize, she said at last, she may, but understand this clearly. Daniel, an apology may reopen the door. It will not restore the arrangement. He swallowed hard enough for her to hear it through the phone, because for the first time, Daniel understood what his mother had finally learned herself. Some things, once taken for granted too long, do not return to what they were before. Brittany arrived at Margaret's house the following Saturday wearing cream slacks, oversized sunglasses, and the brittle expression of a woman who had rehearsed humility in the mirror, but did not entirely believe in it. Daniel walked beside her carrying a bakery box from the expensive place downtown, the kind Brittany usually saved for clients she wanted to impress. Margaret invited them in with polite restraint and served coffee in the good china she had once reserved for family occasions, though this no longer felt like one. For several moments, no one spoke. Brittany kept adjusting the napkin in her lap. Daniel stared at the steam rising from his cup. Finally, Brittany cleared her throat and said, "I owe you an apology." Margaret folded her hands and waited. Brittany gave the kind of smile people wear when they expect credit for doing the bare minimum. "What I said at the party was inappropriate. I was joking, but I understand now that maybe it came out wrong." Margaret's expression did not change. "No," she said gently. "It came out exactly as you meant it. The problem is that you did not expect me to hear it." Brittany's smile vanished. Daniel shifted in his seat. "Mom," he murmured, warning in his tone, but Margaret ignored him. "You did not misspeak," Margaret continued, her voice calm enough to sharpen every word. "You revealed what you think of me. An apology that begins with explanation instead of accountability is not an apology. It is image management." Brittany's cheeks flushed. "That is not fair." Margaret held her gaze. "Neither was 6 years of being treated like unpaid staff in my own son's family." The room went still. Brittany sat straighter, some of the false remorse evaporating beneath the pressure. "We never treated you like staff." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "You assigned me weekly schedules. You informed me of obligations instead of asking. You handed me grocery lists. You once texted me from upstairs asking if I could bring you coffee, while I was cleaning your kitchen after watching your children for 10 hours. Daniel winced. Brittany opened her mouth, then closed it. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Do you know what the cruelest part was, Brittany? It was not the joke. It was the certainty behind it. You said it because you truly believed I would continue accepting whatever scraps of respect you offered, because you believed I needed your family more than you needed me." Brittany's eyes dropped to the table. For the first time since arriving, she looked genuinely unsettled. Daniel rubbed his hands together and said quietly, "We were wrong." Margaret turned to him. "Yes, you were." He swallowed. "We should have appreciated you more." Margaret let the words settle. Then she nodded once. "That is true." Hope flickered across his face too soon. "So, can we move forward?" Margaret almost pitied him for asking so quickly. "We may move forward," she said, "but not backward." Daniel frowned. "What does that mean?" Margaret set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "It means I accept your apology. It means you may bring the children to visit. It means I will continue being their grandmother. But I will not return to daily childcare. I will not be on call. I will not reorganize my life around your schedules. If I choose to help in the future, it will be because I offer, not because you assume." Brittany's lips parted. "But we cannot afford." Margaret raised one hand. Brittany stopped speaking. "Your household finances," Margaret said evenly, "are no longer my burden to solve." The silence that followed was not angry this time. It was stunned, because until that moment, neither of them had fully believed she meant it. They had thought this was a lesson, a temporary punishment, a dramatic pause before life resumed its familiar pattern. But Margaret watched realization dawn in their faces with quiet satisfaction. This was not a negotiation. It was a permanent recalibration. They left 20 minutes later with the untouched half of the pastry box still sitting on her counter. Margaret watched their car pull away from the front window, then carried the pastries into the kitchen and placed them in the trash. They were too sweet, too expensive, and far too late. Over the next month, Daniel and Brittany adjusted because they had no choice. Their complaints gradually shifted from outrage to weary resignation, and for the first time since becoming parents, they were forced to organize their household around their own responsibilities rather than Margaret's availability. They hired a nanny for weekdays and scaled back the extras they had once treated as necessities. The housekeeper now came only twice a month instead of weekly. Their weekend brunches disappeared. Their spontaneous overnight trips vanished entirely. Margaret heard through Helen that Brittany had canceled her boutique gym membership, and Daniel had postponed plans to lease a new luxury SUV. It was remarkable, Margaret thought. How quickly "we cannot manage without you" had translated into "we do not want to sacrifice our lifestyle." And yet the most surprising part was not their struggle. It was how little Margaret missed being at the center of it. Her life had become fuller in the absence of their demands. She took watercolor classes on Wednesday afternoons and discovered she was not very good at painting but enjoyed it anyway. She booked a fall cruise with Helen and spent 2 delightful weeks planning outfits instead of packing diaper bags. She slept later, read more, laughed more. The constant low-grade exhaustion she had carried for years began to fade so gradually she only noticed it when a friend remarked that she looked 10 years younger. Then one Sunday afternoon, while Daniel dropped the children off for their weekly visit, Carter wandered into Margaret's kitchen while she sliced apples for a snack and asked in the plain, guileless voice only children possess, "Grandma, are Mommy and Daddy poor now?" Margaret nearly dropped the knife. "Why would you ask that, sweetheart?" Carter shrugged. "Because Mommy says we used to have more money before you stopped helping." Margaret stood very still. The old hurt returned at once, sharp and familiar. Even now, even after apologies and tears and difficult conversations, they were still framing her boundaries as harm done to them, still teaching their children that Grandma's labor had belonged to the household by default. She knelt to Carter's eye level and brushed his hair gently from his forehead. "No, sweetheart. Mommy and Daddy are not poor. They are just learning that grown-ups have to pay for things when other people stop doing them for free." Carter accepted this with the solemn nod of a child who understood only half the words but sensed the truth in the tone. Later that evening, after Daniel picked up the children, Margaret called him before he had even reached his driveway. "If you and Brittany discuss me in front of the children again as though I somehow damaged your finances by setting boundaries," she said without preamble, "the weekly visits will stop." Silence. Then, "Mom, do not." She cut in, her voice sharper than he had heard it in years. "I tolerated disrespect toward myself for too long. I will not tolerate you teaching my grandchildren to view generosity as debt unpaid." Daniel exhaled heavily. "That was not what we meant. Intent has become your favorite refuge whenever consequences arrive." Another silence. Then quieter. "You are right." Margaret said nothing. He continued, sounding tired in a way she had not heard before. "I did not realize how much of our life was built around you until it was gone. Not just the childcare. Everything. You made things easier. We stopped noticing." Margaret's expression softened only slightly. "That is what people do with steady things, Daniel. They stop noticing them until they break or leave." He swallowed audibly. "I do notice now." Margaret believed him this time. Not fully, not perfectly, but enough to hear the difference. Growth, she had learned, rarely arrived in grand dramatic moments. More often it came through discomfort repeated until denial became impossible. After she hung up, Margaret stood alone in her kitchen for a long while, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the clock above the stove. For years she had mistaken being indispensable for being loved. It had taken losing her usefulness for everyone involved to discover the difference. And perhaps that was the cruelest lesson of all, but also the most necessary. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the maple trees outside Margaret's house in shades of gold and rust, and with it came a rhythm to life that felt almost luxurious in its steadiness. Daniel and Brittany no longer called in panic. They no longer texted demands disguised as requests. Their schedules, once built on the assumption that Margaret would absorb whatever chaos they could not manage, had been forced into something closer to reality. They still struggled. She knew. The nanny had raised her rates after realizing just how disorganized the household truly was. Brittany had quietly taken on fewer clients. Daniel had started leaving the office earlier 3 nights a week to handle school pickup himself. Their lives had not collapsed. Margaret noticed. They had simply become less convenient. One crisp Saturday morning, Daniel arrived alone. He stood on Margaret's porch with his hands in his coat pockets and a look on his face she had not seen since he was young enough to know when he had disappointed her. "Can I come in?" he asked. Margaret stepped aside. They sat at the kitchen table where she had once helped him with multiplication flashcards and college applications and, years later, mortgage paperwork. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared at the steam rising from his coffee. Then he said, "I have been thinking a lot about what you said, about how we stopped noticing." Margaret waited. Daniel rubbed a hand over his jaw. "I did the math." She arched an eyebrow. "The math? On what you were doing for us?" He gave a hollow laugh. "School pickups, after-school care, summer care, date nights, weekends, meals, cleaning up after the kids. All of it. If we had paid market rate for everything you handled over the last 6 years." He paused, then shook his head. It would have been well over $200,000. The number hung in the room between them. Margaret did not react outwardly, though hearing it spoken aloud still struck something in her chest. $200,000. Reduced, alas, to a figure even Daniel could not ignore. "And what did you pay me?" she asked softly. Daniel's eyes dropped. "Nothing." "What did you thank me with?" His voice was barely audible. "Not enough." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "No, not nearly enough." Daniel looked up then, and for the first time in months there was no defensiveness left in him. Only shame. "I let my wife disrespect you because it was easier than confronting her. I let myself believe you were just helping because that was simpler than admitting how much we were taking. And when you stopped, I blamed you instead of facing what we had done." Margaret said nothing. He swallowed. "I am sorry, Mom. Not because things got harder, because I finally understand they should have been harder for us all along. We made our comfort your responsibility." Something in her softened then. Not fully, not all at once, but enough. Not because the wound vanished, because true accountability had finally arrived without being dragged there by consequence alone. She reached across the table and laid her hand over his. "That understanding will matter only if it changes how you live," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "It already has." And perhaps it had. Over the following weeks, Margaret noticed small things. Brittany became more careful, less performative, not warm, exactly, but chastened in a way that suggested reality had humbled her where lectures never could. The children were taught to clean up after themselves instead of leaving chaos for others. Daniel no longer arrived at Margaret's house expecting the children to stay longer than invited. He asked now. He thanked her now. The changes were imperfect. Human beings rarely transformed overnight. But the entitlement had cracked. And once cracked, it could not be restored to what it had been. One evening, as Margaret stood at her kitchen window watching leaves tumble across the lawn, she thought about all the years she had spent believing love meant endless sacrifice. that being a good mother meant giving until there was nothing left. But love without boundaries, she had learned, did not create gratitude. It created appetite. An appetite, left unchecked, always grows. By the time winter settled over the neighborhood and the first snow dusted the rooftops in white, Margaret's life no longer revolved around waiting for someone else to need her. She had become, in ways both small and profound, her own person again. Her cruise with Helen had been wonderful. She had stood on the deck in a navy coat with salt air in her hair and laughed harder than she had in years. She had made friends with a retired couple from Connecticut who invited her to dinner and treated her as interesting company rather than useful help. She had returned home with souvenirs for the children, photographs for her mantle, and a quiet certainty that the best parts of her life had not ended simply because she had grown older. They had merely been postponed while everyone else claimed her time. Christmas arrived with a different kind of gathering than the ones before. Daniel and Brittany hosted, but for the first time in years, Margaret arrived as a guest rather than unpaid staff. The meal was already cooking when she walked in. The table was set. The children ran to greet her in matching pajamas, and Brittany, after a brief hesitation that might once have irritated Margaret, took her coat and said, "We are glad you are here. Not because the turkey needed basting. Not because presents needed wrapping. Not because someone had to watch the children while adults drank wine in the other room. Just because she was there." Margaret noticed the difference immediately. Respect changed the air in a room. During dinner, Carter spilled cranberry sauce and Brittany rose automatically to clean it before catching herself and laughing. "Sorry," she said to Margaret. "Old habits." Margaret smiled faintly. "Better yours than mine." Even Brittany laughed at that. Later, after dessert, Daniel found Margaret alone for a moment near the tree where colored lights reflected softly against the window glass. He handed her a small envelope. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it." Inside was a gift certificate to the travel agency Margaret had used for her cruise, enough for another trip. Tucked behind it was a handwritten note in Daniel's careful script. "Thank you for everything you gave us before we knew enough to value it. I hope this helps repay a small piece of what we owe." Margaret read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. "You do not owe me repayment," she said quietly. "You owe me remembrance." Daniel nodded, eyes glassy with emotion he was trying not to show. "I will not forget again." Margaret believed him, not because people never failed twice, but because some lessons cost too much to ignore once learned. That night, after returning home, Margaret stood in the quiet of her living room and looked around at the life she had reclaimed. The books stacked by her chair, the framed cruise photos on the side table, her half-finished watercolor on the easel near the fireplace, the calendar on the wall filled with plans that belonged only to her. She thought of the woman she had been 1 year earlier, exhausted, overextended, quietly disappearing beneath everyone else's needs, while mistaking her usefulness for love. She hardly recognized that woman now. The truth, Margaret had learned, was simple and brutal. The people who called her free childcare had forgotten something essential. Nothing given in love is actually free. Every sacrifice costs someone something. Time, energy, freedom, selfhood. And when people treat devotion like an entitlement, they should not be surprised when it is withdrawn. Margaret turned off the lights, climbed the stairs to bed, and smiled to herself in the dark. They had once mistaken her kindness for permanence. They had once believed she would keep giving because she always had. They were wrong. And in learning that, they had not only lost the version of her they took for granted, they had finally met the woman she should have been all along.